Tensions around the Strait of Hormuz have surged again, jolting diplomacy that only hours earlier had shown faint signs of movement. After talks in Islamabad brought Iranian and U.S.-linked channels back into the same orbit, even if only indirectly, the mood shifted sharply when Donald Trump posted a new threat, signaling a dramatic escalation. A U.S.-led naval blockade aimed, he said, at restoring freedom of navigation. The immediate effect was to throw a question mark over every diplomatic track still open. The talks in Pakistan had ended without a breakthrough, but the very fact they happened was being read by some as a narrow opening, an opportunity to slow the pace of escalation. That opening now looks smaller and far more fragile. From the perspective of seasoned diplomatic observers, the message behind the threat is not necessarily that diplomacy is dead, but that Washington is choosing coercion as the main instrument, trying to force Tehran into concessions it would not make at the table. The timing is what makes it so destabilizing. The threat landed less than a day after the Islamabad discussions, and it landed with the kind of language that suggests urgency, impatience, and a willingness to gamble. The plan, as described, is also filled with contradiction. A blockade intended to open the strait would in practice involve restricting passage, turning the world's most sensitive energy choke point into an enforced military zone. One diplomatic editor summed up the paradox bluntly, calling it quite extraordinary that in an effort to open the strait, the U.S. would attempt to close it. The legality is also being challenged. Under international law, a naval blockade in peacetime is widely seen as unlawful unless authorized by the UN Security Council or justified under a clear self-defense framework. Even where states have not ratified specific maritime conventions, many provisions are treated as customary international law. The argument being made is that a unilateral blockade, especially one that pressures third countries to comply, would sit outside accepted legal bounds. But the same analyst also pointed to a wider reality that legality has already been eroded across this conflict. Strikes, counterstrikes, and attacks on Gulf targets have all been described as violating the UN Charter. In that context, the blockade threat is not an isolated rupture, but another step in a war where norms have been repeatedly bent or ignored. The bigger political test may now fall on America's allies. Trump's post called on other countries to join the operation, yet many of those same partners have already made clear they do not want to be pulled into the war, particularly after earlier phases of fighting where they say they were not consulted and were left to manage the regional fallout. The question is whether any of them will sign up to a naval mission that could be interpreted as joining the conflict. European governments have publicly distanced themselves from the war, insisting it is not theirs. Even close allies that value freedom of navigation may hesitate if participation means becoming a party to an operation that could trigger Iranian retaliation. The UK is one example often raised in this context. Britain has previously tried to organize international coordination around maritime security, including convening broad coalitions for discussion. But there is a major difference between attending meetings or sharing intelligence and committing naval assets to a U.S.-led blockade with open-ended objectives. Behind the scenes, capitals are expected to face urgent calls with Washington and military planners, weighing alliance pressures against domestic politics and regional risk. For Tehran, the threat strikes at the one lever it has repeatedly used as both deterrent and bargaining chip, the strait itself. Control of access, whether through direct action, harassment, or the implied risk of escalation, has long been Iran's way of reminding the world that it cannot be isolated without consequences. The strait is not just a shipping lane, it is a pressure point where regional security, global energy markets, and national survival narratives collide. Iranian officials have already expressed deep distrust of the U.S., and that distrust is now likely to harden. Even when discussions occur, Tehran's view is that Washington can reverse course abruptly, leaving Iran exposed. In that mindset, a blockade threat so soon after talks reinforces the belief that diplomacy is being used tactically less as a path to settlement and more as a tool to buy time, gather leverage, or shape the battlefield. There is also a practical question: what would a blockade actually look like? In recent days and weeks, vessels from a wide range of countries have continued to pass through the strait, ships linked to Pakistan, India, France, Japan, and others. If the U.S. attempts to stop or turn back commercial traffic, it would create direct confrontations not only with Iran, but with third states whose economies depend on uninterrupted flows. That uncertainty is why some analysts caution that the world should wait to see whether Trump follows through. The history of sharp rhetoric followed by shifting positions has left allies and adversaries alike trying to separate signal from noise. Yet the stakes are too high to dismiss the threat as mere posturing. In the Gulf, anxiety is already building. The Gulf Cooperation Council states Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates sit on the front line of any escalation in the Strait. Their ports, energy infrastructure, and urban centers are within reach if the conflict widens. They also bear the economic shock first, long before it ripples into global markets. Qatar's move to reopen maritime waterways for vessel operations earlier in the day have been seen as a step toward normalization amid uncertainty, but a new security crisis across the water could force rapid reversals. The risk is not only military, it is economic and systemic: insurance costs, shipping delays, and investor panic that can take years to unwind even after fighting stops. One Gulf analyst argued the continuation of the war is a direct security and an economic threat to the GCC, noting that the region advocated against the conflict from the start. The Strait's stability is existential for Gulf economies, and any militarization raises the prospect of a prolonged crisis that reshapes trade, energy pricing, and regional development plans. The same analyst said the U.S. reaction reflects a clear mindset in Trump's administration, that the Islamabad talks, however broad their agenda appeared, were in practice heavily focused on the Strait of Hormuz because it has become Iran's newest source of political leverage. The implication is that Washington views the Strait not merely as a security issue, but as a central bargaining variable, one that could overshadow nuclear discussions and other long-running disputes. That broader point matters because it speaks to feasibility. Complex disputes, nuclear constraints, sanctions relief, regional security guarantees typically take months or years to negotiate. The 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA, took prolonged diplomacy and intricate sequencing. It was later abandoned by the U.S. during Trump's first term, a move that still shapes Tehran's belief that American commitments can be temporary. Now, with the nuclear file only one item on a long list, the idea that a short round of talks could resolve decades of grievances is seen as unrealistic. That feeds the interpretation that the blockade threat is deliberate pressure designed to force movement, not through persuasion, but through economic pain. A diplomatic editor raised the central question: what is Trump trying to achieve with the blockade? One answer is straightforward: pressure on Iran. Tehran has reportedly been generating revenue from shipping passing through, including toll-like payments, and it continues to export oil from key terminals. If a blockade disrupts those flows, it hits Iran's finances. But the analysts also warned that the move could backfire economically on the U.S. and the world. Restricting traffic in the Strait would likely push energy prices higher. Markets would react quickly once trading opens, and the resulting shock could ripple through inflation, transport costs, and consumer prices globally. Beyond pressure, there is speculation about a more ambitious objective: seizing or controlling Iranian oil infrastructure. Attention has focused on Karg Island, Iran's critical oil export hub in the Persian Gulf. If the U.S. were preparing the ground for an operation to control such assets, a blockade could serve as a precursor, isolating the area, shaping the battle space, and limiting Iran's ability to respond. But that scenario would require far more than naval power. It would likely demand ground forces to hold territory and sect installations. Geography matters. Along the Iranian side of the Strait, mountainous terrain provides elevated positions and natural defensive advantages. Any outside force attempting to control the Strait would face the problem of Iran's high ground and coastal systems. A professor based in Tehran argued that taking Iran's oil would require ground troops and would come at a heavy political cost for Washington. He warned it would increase U.S. casualties and deepen domestic pressure on Trump, especially if Americans see the war as unnecessary. He also pointed to the likely spike in U.S. gas prices, an outcome that would cut against Trump's political interests. The professor suggested many in Iran hope the threat is rhetorical rather than operational, part of a pattern where Trump issues dramatic statements and then shifts course hours later. That hope, however, coexists with preparation for worst-case scenarios. He also placed the moment in historical context, recalling that Iran has experienced blockades before. In 1953, during the crisis around Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh's nationalization of Iran's oil industry, Britain imposed measures aimed at choking off Iranian oil exports and starving the government of revenue. That episode ended with profound consequences for Iran's politics and its view of Western intervention. The professor argued that repeating such a strategy in the 21st century would be far harder given modern geopolitics and the global dependence on Gulf energy routes. Still, the danger now is that even an attempted blockade, whether fully enforced or selectively applied, could ignite miscalculation. If U.S. forces stop ships, Iran may respond. If Iran responds, Gulf states may be caught in the middle, and if Gulf states are hit again, the pressure on them to choose sides could intensify. The Gulf region's ability to prevent escalation may depend on what kind of war this becomes and how it ends. Some Gulf voices continue to favor diplomacy and de-escalation, leaning on mediation channels and backdoor communication. Others argue deterrence is now the priority, especially after attacks that have already reached Gulf territory. One regional analyst described two schools of thought, one focused on deterrence, the other on diplomacy, often reflected in different emphases among GCC states. Oman and Qatar are typically associated with mediation and dialogue. The UAE and Saudi Arabia, while also pursuing diplomacy in recent years, are seen as more directly focused on hard security, particularly after physical targeting and the reality of missile and drone threats. Yet the war may also be pushing the GCC toward a more collective security mindset. Despite differing policies and rivalries, the shared vulnerability exposed by the conflict is reinforcing the idea that their security is intertwined. Attacks that undermine one state's stability can reverberate across the bloc through markets, investor confidence, and the risk of contagion. As this crisis enters a new phase, the world is watching for the next signal, whether the blockade threat becomes an order, whether allies comply or refuse, and whether Iran chooses restraint or escalation. For now, diplomacy remains technically possible, but it is being squeezed by military logic and political brinkmanship. And in the Strait of Hormuz, where geography compresses global trade into a narrow corridor, small decisions can produce outsized consequences. He said it doesn't necessarily mean diplomacy is over, but it means that he has decided to put pressure on to try and change the answer of those in Tehran. He said, really quite extraordinary what he's decided to do to get freedom of navigation. He is launching a naval blockade. In other words, in an effort to open the strait, he is now closing the strait. Absolutely as well under international law. He said the U.S. military is locked and loaded and at some point will finish up. What little is left of Iran. Ask us. He said, we just have to wait and see whether Trump is going to actually do what he's saying he's going to do.